the Galactic Military Academy, had stood on the crystal moon of Vareth 7 for 12,000 years, and in all that time it had trained the finest military officers from over 400 different species across the known galaxy. The Academy was massive beyond human understanding, and its silver towers reached toward the stars like fingers trying to touch the heavens, and its training halls could hold entire armies, and its libraries contained the military knowledge of civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth had even formed its first oceans. But the true pride of the Academy was not its buildings or its libraries or even its legendary instructors. The true pride was a single simulation. They called it the Siege of Kethrani Prime, and it was the most perfect military training scenario ever created, and for 103 years it had run without pause, and in all that time not a single species had ever completed it. The scenario was simple in concept but impossible in execution. A fortified city stood on a resource pool world, and enemy forces surrounded it on all sides, and these enemies had unlimited reinforcements and superior technology, and absolutely no interest in negotiation or surrender, and the defenders had to hold the city for 5 standard years, while somehow evacuating the entire civilian population to safety. Every mathematical model predicted failure within 18 months, and every strategic calculation showed that victory was simply not achievable. And this was by design. Commandant Urixthil had watched over the simulation for the past 60 years, and his forearms bore the ceremonial scars of 9 actual military campaigns, and his hard carapace showed the marks of battles that would have killed lesser beings 10 times over. He had seen 347 attempts to complete the simulation, and every single one had ended in failure. The Valeri had tried first with their famous hive mind coordination and their ability to think as one unified consciousness across thousands of individual bodies, and they had lasted 6 months before their forces collapsed under the endless pressure. The Drexian War Masters had come next, and these were beings who had conquered the entire Andromeda reach over 1,000-year campaign, and their tactical knowledge was legendary across 12 galaxies, and they managed 8 months before admitting defeat. The Crystalline Collective had given perhaps the most impressive attempt, and these silicon-based beings could process battle data at the speed of light, and they could calculate 10 million possible outcomes in the time it took other species to blink. And they held for 2 years before finally acknowledging that the mathematics simply did not allow for victory. Species after species had tried, and species after species had failed, and the simulation had become less of a test and more of a lesson. It taught humility. It taught that some battles simply could not be won. It taught that even the greatest military minds in the galaxy had limits, and Commandant Urixthil had come to accept this as simple truth. Then the humans arrived. The ship appeared in orbit around Vareth 7 on what seemed like an ordinary day, and the vessel was small by galactic standards, and it was not particularly elegant, and it bore the scars of a journey across hostile space. Earth had only recently been admitted to the Galactic Accords, and the decision had been controversial among the member species. The humans came from what the Galactic Classification System labeled a Class 12 Death World, and this designation made other species deeply uncomfortable. A Class 12 Death World was a planet so hostile that simply surviving childhood was considered a statistical miracle, and Earth qualified for this classification in almost every possible category. Gravity was crushing by galactic standards, and it pulled on bones and muscles with a force that would have crippled most species. Within hours, the atmosphere was toxic, and it was filled with a highly reactive gas called oxygen that the humans not only tolerated but actually required to survive, and they breathed this oxidizing poison willingly, and their bodies had evolved to depend on it. The temperature variations were extreme, and the planet could swing from frozen wastelands to burning deserts within the same rotation, and the humans had somehow learned to survive in all of these environments. the planet was filled with predators and parasites and diseases that evolved faster than most civilizations could develop medicine, and every living thing on Earth seemed designed to kill every other living thing, and yet the humans had not only survived, they had thrived. They had built civilizations and developed technology and reached out into the stars. And now 37 of their young were walking through the halls of the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy. The human cadets were young by galactic standards, and most were barely 2 decades old, and in the eyes of longer-lived species, they were practically infants. But their bodies told different stories. The medical scans had disturbed the academy physicians greatly, and they showed bone density that registered as geological anomaly on standard equipment, and they showed scar tissue from injuries that would have killed a Corthan twice over, and they showed cardiovascular systems that could operate under stress loads that should have been mechanically impossible. Cadet Commander Sarah Chun walked at the front of the human group, and her dark eyes scanned the academy architecture with an expression that the Corthan instructors could not quite read. She was not tall by human standards, and she was not physically imposing in any obvious way, and yet something about her presence made the alien cadets step aside as she passed behind her walked technical specialist Marcus Webb, and he was already muttering calculations under his breath, and his eyes moved constantly as if measuring everything around him. And beside him stood Tactical Officer Dmitry Volkov, and he was large even by human standards, and when he cracked his knuckles, the sound echoed through the hall like breaking stone. Commandant Yurik still gathered all the new cadets in the Great Hall for orientation, and he stood before them with all 4 arms spread in the traditional gesture of welcome and authority, explained the academy traditions and the training schedule and the expectations for all cadets, and then he told them about the siege of Kathrani Prime. He described its history and its purpose, and the many species that had attempted it, and he explained that the human cadets would be given the standard 6-month evaluation period before they would be allowed to attempt the simulation. Sarah Chun raised her hand, and when Rick still acknowledged her, she spoke in a voice that was calm and steady. She said they would like to attempt the simulation now. The Great Hall fell completely silent. A Valori delegate in the crowd felt his antennae twitch in what might have been amusement or horror, or perhaps both. Commandant Yurik still looked at the young human, and for a moment he did not know what to say. He tried to explain that species with 10 times their civilization's age had failed, and that preparation was essential, and that rushing into the simulation would only result in quick defeat. Sarah Chun simply nodded and said that with respect they had reviewed all the historical attempts, and they had some ideas they wanted to try. Rick still felt his mandibles click together in the Corthan equivalent of a resigned sigh, and after a long moment he agreed, told them to report to Simulation Chamber 7. At dawn, as the humans filed out of the Great Hall, a Drexian instructor leaned close to the Commandant and asked if they should prepare the psychological counseling protocols for when the humans failed. Eric's tell watched Sarah Chun walk away, and he felt something strange stir in his gut, and it was a feeling he had not experienced in decades. He told the instructor to prepare the protocols, but added that something told him they would not need them. Could not explain why he felt this way, but watching the humans disappear into the corridor, he felt the first whisper of something that might have been fear. The night before the simulation, the human cadets gathered in their assigned barracks, and the room was small by academy standards, but the humans did not seem to mind. They had grown up on a world where space was always limited and where competition for resources was simply a fact of life, and a small room with a roof and warmth was more than many of their ancestors had ever known. Sarah Chun stood at the center of the group, and around her sat the 36 other humans who had traveled across the galaxy to prove themselves at this ancient academy. They were a diverse group, and they came from every corner of Earth, and they spoke different languages and held different beliefs, and yet they shared something fundamental. They were all children. Of a Deathworld, Marcus Webb had pulled up holographic displays of every previous attempt at the siege of Kathrani. Prime and the data floated in the air like glowing ghosts, and he walked the group through each failure with careful attention to detail. The Valori had tried to defend every inch of the city simultaneously, and their hive mind had allowed perfect coordination, but they had spread their forces too thin, and eventually the endless enemy reinforcements had overwhelmed them through sheer attrition. The Drexian War Masters had attempted aggressive defense, and they had launched counterattacks against enemy positions, and they had won many battles, but the enemy simply replaced every lost soldier with two more, and eventually the mathematics caught up with them. The Crystalline Collective had tried to optimize every variable, and they had calculated the perfect defensive positions and the most efficient use of resources, and they had extended the siege longer than anyone else, but even perfect efficiency could not overcome infinite enemy numbers. Every species had approached the problem the same way. They had tried to win the siege. Dmitry Volkov leaned back against the wall, and his massive arms were crossed over his chest, and a smile played at the corners of his mouth. He asked the group what all these species had in common. A young cadet named Yuki Tanaka answered that they had all been playing defense. Dmitry nodded and said that was exactly right, and he pointed out that every single species had accepted the basic premise of the scenario, and they had all tried to defend the city against the siege, but humans did not think like other species. Humans came from a world that had tried to kill them every single day for millions of years, and they had survived not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being the most adaptable and the most creative, and the most willing to do whatever was necessary. Sarah Chen pulled up a new display, and this one showed the full scope of the simulation, including details that previous species had apparently ignored. The enemy forces were produced by automated orbital factories, and these factories were protected by a defensive grid powered by 3 fusion reactors on a distant moon, and the previous attempts had all treated this production capacity as an unchangeable fact, but nothing was unchangeable. The city they were meant to defend contained an industrial district that had been offline since the simulation began, and this district included chemical processing plants and heavy manufacturing equipment and raw material storage. Previous species had seen these as resources to be protected. Humans saw them as tools to be used. Marcus Webb had spent the journey to Vareth 7 studying human military history, and he had paid particular attention to the conflicts that other species found most disturbing. Humans had invented something called total war, and this concept was almost unknown among galactic civilizations. Most species fought limited conflicts with clear rules and defined boundaries, and the goal was usually to achieve specific objectives while minimizing destruction. Humans had learned to fight differently. When survival was at stake, humans would burn their own cities to deny them to the enemy, and they would poison their own wells, and they would destroy everything of value rather than let it fall into hostile hands, and they would rebuild from the ashes afterward. This was not cruelty. This was simply what survival required on a death world. Other cadets listened as Marcus explained his plan, and at first, some of them looked uncertain, but as he continued, their expressions changed. They began to smile. Yuki Tanaka laughed and said it was absolutely insane. Dmitry Volkov grinned and said that was why it would work. Sarah Chen looked around the room at her fellow humans, and she felt a surge of pride in her chest. These were her people. They had crossed the galaxy together, and they had trained together, and they had prepared for this moment, and now they would show the rest of the universe what it meant to be children of Earth. She reminded them that the simulation would try to kill them, and that the environmental hazards were designed to be lethal, and that the enemy forces would respond to any aggression with overwhelming counterattacks. Some of them might die in the simulation. The Academy used neural feedback technology that made simulated death feel completely real. and cadets had been known to suffer psychological trauma from particularly intense failures. But humans had been dying for millions of years, and they had learned to accept death as simply another obstacle to be overcome. A cadet named James Okonkwo spoke up, and he said that on Earth, they had a saying about acceptable losses. Another cadet named Elena Vasquez added that they had another saying about victory, requiring sacrifice. Sarah Chun nodded and said that the civilians in the simulation had children, and those children were counting on their defenders, and humans did not abandon children because the odds looked bad. The room fell silent for a moment. Every human in that room knew what it meant to protect the young. It was perhaps the most fundamental instinct that their species possessed. They had evolved on a world where children were vulnerable for years before they could defend themselves, and where every generation was responsible for ensuring the survival of the next, and where the worst crime imaginable was to abandon those who could not protect themselves. The alien species had seen the civilians in the simulation as a logistical problem. The humans saw them as the reason for fighting. Sarah Chun told her cadets to get some rest because tomorrow they would make history. But none of them slept that night. They lay in their bunks and they thought about home, and they thought about the ancestors who had survived impossible odds, and they thought about the future. They were fighting to create. They were Deathworlders. She were children of a planet that had tried to destroy them since the first single-celled organism had appeared in the primordial seas. And they had not only survived, they had conquered tomorrow. They would show the galaxy what that meant. When dawn came, the humans rose as one, and they dressed in their simulation gear, and they walked together through the academy halls. Other cadets stopped to watch them pass, and instructors paused their conversations. And even the automated systems seemed to track their movement. There was something different about these humans today, something dangerous, something that made older and wiser beings feel a chill run down their spines. The doors to Simulation Chamber 7 stood before them, and they were massive and ancient and covered in the marks of countless cadets who had entered before Sarah Chun placed her hand on the scanner, and the doors began to open. Beyond them lay the impossible scenario. Beyond them lay the test that had defeated the greatest military minds in the galaxy. The humans stepped forward into the light. The simulation chamber was a cathedral of light and mathematics, and it stretched upward into darkness, and its walls pulsed with the energy of 1,000 processors working in perfect harmony. This technology could render entire worlds in perfect detail, and it could simulate armies of millions with individual artificial intelligence, and it could create environments so real that the brain could not tell the difference between simulation and reality. As the human cadets took their positions, the observers began to fill the viewing gallery above. Representatives from 18 different species had gathered to watch, and most of them wore expressions of polite skepticism, and a few showed something like pity for the young humans who were about to fail so spectacularly. Commandant Uric still stood at the front of the gallery, and his forearms were folded across his chest, and his ancient eyes watched the humans with an intensity that surprised even himself. The simulation loaded world of Kethrani Prime materialized around the human cadets, and suddenly they were no longer standing in a chamber, but in the heart of a war-torn city. Buildings rose around them, and many were damaged, and some were burning, and the sky above was dark with smoke, and the distant sounds of enemy artillery echoed through the streets. Tactical displays showed the full scope of the disaster. Enemy forces massed at every horizon, and their numbers were beyond counting, and more arrived every hour from the orbital factories above. Ammunition stores were critically low, and food supplies would last perhaps 3 weeks, and medical resources were nearly exhausted. Morale indicators flickered deep in the red, and the simulated defenders were terrified and exhausted, and many had already given up hope. Below the streets, the civilian population huddled in underground shelters, and there were over 200,000 of them, and many were children, and they were waiting for someone to save Their evacuation transports had been destroyed in the opening assault, and there was no way off. The planet Sarah Chun surveyed the battlefield, and her dark eyes moved across the displays with calm precision, and she took exactly 43 seconds to assess the entire situation. Then she began giving orders. She called for Marcus Webb to give her a report on the enemy supply lines. He responded immediately and explained that the enemy reinforcements were produced by automated orbital factories, and these factories generated new troops every 6 hours, and the factories were protected by a defensive grid powered by 3 fusion reactors on the far moon. Sarah nodded and asked Dmitry Volkov about the industrial district. He reported that it was intact but offline, and that it contained pre-war manufacturing capability, including heavy machinery and chemical processing plants. His eyes glinted as he added that the chemical plants included fertilizer production facilities. The observers in the gallery exchanged confused glances, and several whispered to each other about what agriculture could possibly have to do with siege warfare. Sarah smiled, and it was a thin, dangerous expression that made several alien observers instinctively move backward. She asked if everyone remembered the briefing materials. 36 humans nodded in unison. Sarah said it was time to introduce their new friends to the concept of total war. What followed would be studied and analyzed and debated at military academies across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. In the first 3 minutes, the humans did something that no previous species had ever attempted. Instead of defending, they attacked. They did not attack the enemy forces. They attacked their own city. Teams of humans began systematically dismantling non-essential buildings, and they worked with a speed and ferocity that looked like madness, and they salvaged every piece of useful material they could find. Metal and wire and chemicals and electronics were pulled from structures that previous defenders had tried to protect, and the humans treated their own infrastructure as nothing more than raw resources to be exploited. The observers in the gallery watched in stunned silence. From minutes 4 through 7, the chemical processing plants roared to life for the first time since the simulation began. Marcus Webb led a team in synthesizing compounds that made the Valori observers physically ill when their antennae detected the chemical signatures. The humans were making explosives, not the refined military-grade explosives that came from factories, but crude and brutal mixtures that their ancestors had used for centuries. They created propellants from industrial chemicals, and they mixed fuels that burned at temperatures the simulation had never been programmed to render, and they built devices that were ugly and simple and devastatingly effective. A crystalline observer calculated the explosive yield of what the humans were producing, and the number made his mineral matrices flicker in alarm. From minutes 8 through 12, 3 teams of humans left the city. This was unprecedented behavior, and the simulation was designed to punish any offensive action with overwhelming counterforce, and previous species had learned quickly that leaving the defensive perimeter meant death. But the humans did not engage the enemy army. They went around it. They moved through terrain that the simulation classified as impassable, and they crossed radiation zones that should have killed them in minutes. And they waded through toxic marshlands, and they climbed a volcanic rift where the temperature exceeded what most species could survive. The simulation registered their passage and calculated their deaths and waited for them to fall, but they did not fall. One observer asked why the humans were not dying, and he pointed out that the environmental hazards were active and functioning, and by every measurement, the humans should have been dead 10 times over. Another observer answered in a quiet voice that the humans were from a death world, and that these conditions were simply an ordinary day for them. The volcanic rift that should have been lethal was actually cooler than some of the deserts on Earth. The radiation zone that should have caused immediate cellular breakdown was less intense than the cosmic rays that humans had evolved to resist. Toxic marshland was practically a vacation compared to some of the swamps their ancestors had survived. A Three teams reached the far moon after 17 minutes. The orbital defense grid detected them immediately, and targeting systems locked on and weapons prepared to fire, but human reflexes had been honed by millions of years of dodging predators, and they could react faster than the automated systems could track, and they moved through the defensive fire like water flowing around stones, using the improvised explosives they had created. The humans disabled the first reactor, then the second, then the third. Defensive grid protecting the orbital factories went dark. At minute 18, the humans revealed the final phase of their plan. They had converted 3 civilian evacuation shuttles into what Marcus Webb cheerfully called the biggest fireworks display this simulation had ever seen. The shuttles launched, and they carried payloads of crude explosives and improvised incendiaries, and they flew toward the now unprotected orbital factories. The factories had no defenses left, and they had been designed with the assumption that the defensive grid would always protect them, and they were completely vulnerable. The shuttles struck their targets. The explosions lit up the simulated sky, and the factories detonated in cascading blasts that could be seen from the surface, and debris rained down through the atmosphere like falling stars. At minute 20, the enemy army on the ground faced a situation that the simulation had never been designed to handle. There would be no more reinforcements, ever. Enemy commander was an artificial intelligence of considerable sophistication, and it had been programmed to pursue victory through attrition, and it had always assumed that infinite reinforcements would eventually overwhelm any defense. Now it ran the calculations against forces were finite for the first time since the simulation began, and it was facing an enemy that had just demonstrated a willingness to do absolutely anything to achieve victory, and the mathematics had completely changed. AI did the only logical thing. It surrendered. The simulation froze, and the words "Victory achieved" appeared in glowing letters across the sky of Kethrani Prime. The mission clock read 20 minutes and 17 seconds. In the viewing gallery, no one spoke. Commandant Urix Thill stared at the frozen display, and his mandibles hung open in an expression of pure shock, and his forearms had dropped limply to his sides. The simulation that had stood undefeated for 103 years had been completed by human cadets in less time than it took him to eat his morning meal. The galaxy would never be the same. The simulation chamber lights came up slowly, and the frozen ruins of Kethrani Prime faded away like a dream upon waking, and the 37 human cadets stood in the empty space where a city had been moments before. Most of them were not even breathing hard. Sarah Chun stood at the center of the group, and her uniform was dusty from the simulated battle, and there was a small cut on her cheek from debris. But otherwise she looked as calm as if she had just finished a morning exercise. Dmitry Volkov was rolling his shoulders to work out the tension, and Marcus Webb was already pulling up data on his portable display, and the other cadets were checking on each other with the easy familiarity of soldiers who had just shared a victory. In the viewing gallery above, 18 species sat in absolute silence. No one knew what to say. Commandant Urix Thill stared at the mission clock that still displayed the final time, and his mind struggled to process what he had just witnessed. 20 minutes and 17 seconds. 103 years of accumulated military doctrine had just been overturned in the time it took him to review morning reports. A Drexian War Master was the first to find his voice, and even then it came out cracked and uncertain. He said that what they had seen was not possible. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah Chun looked up at the gallery, and her expression was calm and patient, as if she were explaining something simple to a confused child. She asked if anyone had questions. For a long moment, no one spoke, and then suddenly, everyone began speaking at once, and the gallery erupted in a chaos of alien languages and translator devices struggling to keep up. Commandant Urix Thill raised all 4 arms and called for order, and slowly the noise died down. A Valori Observer leaned forward and his antennae were twitching rapidly in what might have been distress or fascination or both. He asked how the humans had known to attack the factory's Marcus. Webb answered, and he explained that the factories were the source of the enemy reinforcements and that removing the source removed the problem. The Velori pressed further and asked why no other species had thought of this approach. Webb shrugged and said he could not speak for other species, but he suspected they had been thinking about the problem wrong. He pulled up holographic displays showing the tactical decisions the humans had made, and the data floated in the air between the floor and the gallery. Every previous attempt had focused on the siege itself, and they had tried to defend better or counterattack smarter or manage resources more efficiently. Humans had asked a different question. They had asked what conditions made the siege possible, and then they had removed those conditions. Dmitry Volkov offered his own perspective, and he said with a hint of amusement that they had cheated. He asked if cheating was allowed. Webb shook his head and said they had not cheated, and that every action they took was within the rules of the simulation. They had simply solved a different problem than the one everyone assumed they were solving. Sarah Chun stepped forward and addressed the entire gallery. She explained that the scenario assumed certain constraints and that defenders would defend, and that environmental hazards were obstacles rather than tools, and that the enemy production capacity was untouchable. She shrugged and said that on Earth they had learned early that constraints were suggestions. When something was trying to eat you, then you did not fight fair. You fought final. The gallery fell silent again as the implications of her words sank. A young Corthan cadet in the back raised a trembling claw and asked about the casualties. Simulations showed that 12% of the human assault teams had been killed during the attack on the moon, and another 8% had suffered serious injuries. How could the humans accept such losses so easily? Sarah Chen's expression did not change as she acknowledged the casualty rate. She said it was acceptable. The young Corthan's voice rose in disbelief as he repeated the word acceptable. Chen nodded and explained that the mission required those risks and that the assault teams knew what they were volunteering for and that every single one of them had stepped forward willingly. She pointed out that the shelters below the city had contained 200,000 civilians. Many of them were children. She said that humans did not let children die because the math looked bad. The Drexian War Master leaned forward and his scarred face was troubled. Said that in his culture, a commander who accepted such losses would be considered reckless at best and criminal at worst. Chen met his eyes without flinching. She said that in human culture, a commander who let civilians die to preserve military assets would be considered a coward. The silence that followed was heavier than planetary gravity. Commandant Yurixthil finally spoke, and his voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire chamber. He asked Chun to explain human military philosophy. She considered the question for a moment, and then she told them about Earth. She told them about a world where every living thing was in competition with every other living thing, and where predators stalked the shadows, and where the weather itself could kill, and where diseases evolved faster than medicine could be. Developed humans had survived this world not by being the strongest or the fastest. They had survived by being willing to do whatever was necessary. She explained the concept of total war and how humans did not separate military targets from infrastructure targets, and how they would burn their own cities and poison their own wells if it meant denying resources to an enemy. She told them about the scorched earth tactics that human armies had used for thousands of years and how they would destroy everything rather than let it fall into hostile hands. And she told them about sacrifice. Humans understood that some victories required paying a terrible price, and they had learned this lesson over millions of years of survival. An older Velori observer asked if humans had no concept of mercy or restraint. Chun smiled, and it was a sad expression that made her look older than her years. She said that humans had great capacity for mercy and that they valued life deeply and that they did not enjoy killing or destruction. But when something threatened what they loved, then mercy became a luxury they could not afford. Restraint became a weakness that would get their children killed. Survival came first. Everything else came after. The gallery remained silent as her words sank. And these young humans had just demonstrated something that the assembled observers were only beginning to understand. Humans were not just another species joining the galactic community. They were something entirely different. They had been forged in the fires of the most hostile environment any of them had ever encountered, and they had emerged from that crucible with a psychology that was fundamentally alien to species that had evolved on gentler worlds. They were prey animals that had learned to fight like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. They were survivors who had turned survival itself into an art form. They were now part of the galactic community, whether the other species liked it or not. Commandant Urix still looked down at Sarah Chun, and for the first time in his long career, he felt genuinely uncertain about the future. These humans were cadets. They were young and inexperienced, and they had only just begun their training, and they had just accomplished something that the greatest military minds in the galaxy had failed to do for over a century. What would they be capable of when they were fully trained? What would they be capable of when they had armies at their command? The old Corthan did not know, and that uncertainty frightened him more than any enemy he had ever faced. 3 standard months had passed since the humans completed the siege of Kethrani Prime, and in that time, the Galactic Military Academy had been transformed. The news had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and every species with access to communication networks had heard the story of the human cadets and their impossible victory. Some refused to believe it, and they claimed the reports were exaggerated, or that the simulation had malfunctioned, or that the humans had somehow found a way to actually cheat. But the recordings were clear and undeniable, and they showed exactly what had happened and how, and those recordings terrified everyone who watched them. Commandant Urixthil had spent the past 3 months working with the human cadets to develop something unprecedented in the history of the Academy. It was a new core curriculum that would be taught to cadets of all species, and it drew upon the unique perspective that humans brought to warfare and survival. They called it Deathworld Strategic Doctrine. The cadets quickly gave it another name. They called it Thinking Like Prey. The curriculum was built around lessons that the humans considered obvious, but that other species found deeply disturbing. The first lesson was perhaps the most fundamental, and it explained how humans saw themselves in the universe. Most species assumed that the dominant civilization on any world would develop a psychology of apex predators, and that they would see themselves as the strongest and most dangerous creatures in existence. Humans were different. Despite everything they had achieved, and despite the fact that they had conquered their entire planet and reached out into the stars, they still did not see themselves as apex predators. Their psychology was still that of a mid-tier species on a world designed to kill them. This meant that humans never assumed they were safe, and they never stopped scanning for threats, and they never stopped planning escape routes and contingencies. And when they were cornered, they fought with the desperate creativity of creatures who fully expected to die. This desperation was not a weakness. It was their greatest strength. Second lesson explained how humans viewed resources, and this lesson disturbed the crystalline collective more than any other species. Most civilizations treated resources as precious things to be protected and preserved, and they built defensive strategies around keeping their supplies safe from enemy capture. Humans saw resources as tools to be used and nothing more. They would burn their own cities to deny them to the enemy, and they would poison their own food supplies, and they would destroy their own infrastructure, and then they would figure out how to survive without any of it. Every object in the human worldview was a potential weapon, and every obstacle was a potential advantage. Nothing was sacred except survival itself. The Third lesson was the one that made other species most uncomfortable, and it dealt with the human concept of acceptable losses. Humans understood that some victories required sacrifice, and they had internalized this truth at a fundamental level. They would send soldiers into certain death if the mission required it, and those soldiers would go willingly, because they understood that their death served a purpose. This was not cruelty or callousness, it was the cold mathematics of survival that humans had learned over millions of years. The fourth lesson dealt with what humans called asymmetric warfare, and it explained how a weaker force could defeat a stronger one through unconventional means. Humans had spent most of their evolutionary history as the weaker force, and they had survived by refusing to fight on terms that favored their enemies. They used poison and fire and misdirection and psychological manipulation, and they struck from ambush and vanished before retaliation could find them. There was no such thing as an unfair fight in human philosophy. There was only winning and losing meant death. The final lesson was perhaps the most important, and it dealt with human motivation. Most species fought for territory or resources or abstract concepts. Like honor and glory, humans fought for each other. They fought for their families and their communities and their children, and they would do absolutely anything to protect those they loved. This made them predictable in some ways, because you could always know what a human would die for. But it also made them terrifying because there was no limit to what they would do in defense of their loved ones. The new curriculum was met with mixed reactions across the academy. Some cadets embraced it, and they worked hard to understand the human perspective, and they began incorporating Deathworld thinking into their own tactical approaches. Others rejected it completely, and they argued that such brutal philosophies had no place in civilized warfare, and that adopting human methods would make them no better than savages, and some simply could not understand it at all, because their psychology was too different, and they could not imagine thinking the way humans thought. Commandant Rick Still stood before the Academy Governing Council to deliver his final report on the Human Integration Program. The council chamber was vast and ancient, and representatives from the 12 founding species sat in their traditional positions around the curved table. Rick Still summarized everything that had happened since the humans arrived, and he described the simulation victory and the development of the new curriculum and the varied reactions from other species. He concluded with a recommendation, said that the council needed to immediately revise their threat assessment protocols, and that the humans were not simply a new member species joining the galactic community. They were a paradigm shift of Valori. Council member objected and argued that Rick Still was surely exaggerating, and that the humans had only defeated a simulation. Eric's turned to face the counselor directly. He said that the humans had defeated a simulation that was mathematically unsolvable. He said they had done so in 20 minutes. He said they had done so with 37 cadets who had not even finished their first year of training. Then he leaned forward and placed all 4 arms on the council table. He asked the council to imagine what the humans could do with an actual army. The council chamber fell silent. Far away on the crystal moon of Varus 7, the human cadets continued their training. Sarah Chun stood at a viewport in the Academy Residence Hall, and she watched the distant stars through the transparent wall behind her. The other humans were gathered in small groups, and they were talking and laughing and planning for the future. They had proven something to the galaxy, and now they had to decide what to do with the attention they had earned. Some wanted to return to Earth and share what they had learned with the military forces back home. Others wanted to stay at the Academy and continue their training and learn everything the galaxy had to teach them. Few were already talking about the challenges that lay ahead and the enemies that humanity might face as they expanded into the stars. Dmitry Volkov came to stand beside Sarah, and he looked out at the same stars. He asked her what she was thinking about. She told him she was thinking about home, not Earth specifically, but the concept of home and what it meant to protect something. She said, that humans had spent millions of years fighting to survive on a world that wanted them dead, and now they were part of a galaxy filled with wonders and dangers they had never imagined. Stakes had gotten bigger, but the mission remained the same: survival protection of the young and the vulnerable, building a future worth living in. Dimitri nodded and said that some things never changed. Sarah smiled and said that was exactly right. They were prey animals from a world that had tried to destroy them since the beginning of time, and they had learned over those millions of years that the only way prey could survive was by becoming more dangerous than the predators ever imagined possible. The galaxy was about to learn that lesson too, whether they were ready for it or not. Outside the viewport, the stars burned cold and eternal, and somewhere among them, Earth continued its ancient dance around its yellow sun, and the children of that Deathworld looked up at the universe with eyes that had been forged in fire. They were ready for whatever came next. They always had been.